want to thank, of course, all of the contributors for their fantastic contributions that help us better understand Hugh Grant's image, but also offer insight into the deeper workings of celebrity culture in both historical and contemporary frameworks. And I'm very excited to hear from everyone today and to have a great discussion about Hugh Grant. And I'll just add that my son is a big Paddington fan, and so of course we had to rewatch Paddington 2 when we were Paddington, well, both Paddington and Paddington 2 when I was reading this, and he was very thrilled by that. So thank you for making that happen in my household.
Thank you so much to the both of you, and thank you for all your support and faith in this issue from the very start, and your own shepherding through the whole process. We really, both Alice and I are really grateful for that. Thank you. So Alice, would you like to tell us a bit more of where we were when we started to think about this issue?
Back in 2019, indeed. Where this all began is actually probably the 90s. Eleonora and with our mums, and both Eleonora and I realized we've both grown up in continental Europe, in Italy and in France, and have mums that are obsessed with Hugh Grant. And grew up kind of watching Hugh Grant on film and TV, and realizing upon arriving to the UK that actually not all Englishmen are Hugh Grant, very disappointingly. But so jokes aside, they were really motivated by kind of two factors. The first was this Grant's image as a kind of icon or embodiment of Englishness, the kind of bumbling gentleman part of our title. And our desire was to really try to unpack this essentializing of national identity of Englishness, and to think also about how that is rooted via Grant in intersections of privilege, class, gender, and race. And secondly, this really fit into our wider research interest for both of us to take popular culture and escapist entertainment seriously. Eleonora is a musical scholar and a romantic comedy scholar. And we found that Grant's strong association with the rom-com, with the kind of often dismissed genre, also played a part in him being overlooked as a subject of critical study. And back when we first had the idea, so this was 2019, when we had the idea for the special issue, Grant was going through his own reconnaissance. Paddington 2 had just been released. He was, there were rumors of an Oscars going around, a very English scandal. It was also happening, and we were interested in this turn. But as Claire's, for instance, piece in the article said, questions, was it really a turn? So that was where we were coming from. Eleonora, I don't want to take over.
Yeah. And something to think about, and something that we were also both concerned, being from continental Europe, was Brexit that was going on at the time, and our vocal Hugh Grant was in the old campaign against Brexit. So that was another point of interest for us. So seeing how he was using a social media platform like Twitter to talk more about politics, even though it doesn't have a proper, let's say, clear political siding, but it was really interesting for us to see how he was positioning himself in that particular moment. And something that is connected to privilege, and that for me, as somebody who also studies gender, was particularly interesting and stimulating to think about, was how Grant has managed to negotiate different crises or performative crises of masculinity in the last 30 or so years, and how his own characters and his own persona as a star has managed to negotiate these kind of changes. And this is something that I think pretty much all the articles in one way or another touch upon, thinking about different constructions of masculinity, as in Rebecca's article, for example, or in terms of aging, as in Marion's article. So that's something that for us was particularly interesting. And another context, as you've mentioned, for this issue was the COVID-19 pandemic. So we definitely had a few bumps on the road, and unfortunately we also had to say goodbye to a couple of people who couldn't write their own articles because their articles were based on archival research and they couldn't access the archives during the pandemic. And one of these articles would have been indeed on masculinity through the archival material through men's magazines in the 90s, which we thought would have been a really great contribution. But we are glad that in some way or another, we have managed to talk a bit more about masculinity. And something that perhaps we haven't been able to include was indeed the reception of Hugh Grant, also thinking about fandom. And that's something that, as an avid Tumblr user myself, I've been noticing quite a bit on this social media platform in particular. And it's quite interesting to see how there's a lot of interest around Maurice. So thinking about Claire's article and her own work on the fandom of Maurice, for example, in terms of this sort of like queer reading of the film that challenges this idea of hegemonic masculinity. And at the same time, there's also an interest for films like Sense and Sensibility that instead has to do more with the pretty aesthetics of the film and the prettiness of Hugh Grant himself in those films. So I think that's something that's really interesting and that perhaps can be explored a bit more in the future as well, in future research. As a final word, we want to say a huge thank you to, again, Erin and Alice, to all our fantastic contributors who were able to work on these articles through the pandemic. And also a big thank you goes to all the reviewers who have made this issue possible as well. And maybe there are a few of you in the audience, so a big thank you to all of you. Alice, do you want to add anything else?
No, it's been 4 years, we said earlier, 4 years, nearly 5, that this idea came together. So just a huge thank you to everyone from the both of us. It's been a journey full of other crises, but we got crises, that's not a word, but we got there in the end.
Yeah, definitely. So now we want to leave the floor to our contributors, and we thought that we could go in the order in which the articles will be published. So we have first Claire Monk, then Renée Middlemost, Lydia Millington, Rebecca Feasey, and Marion Hallet. And there's a sixth contributor, Leonard Soberon, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight because is doing field work outside of Europe right now, so he couldn't join us tonight, but we're going to say a few words about his article as well. So we're going to give each contributor about 5 minutes more or less to talk about their articles. So if you can please introduce yourself first, and then you're free to talk about your article. So the first one is Claire. Claire, please tell us a bit more about your article.
Well, first, thank you, big thank you to the editors and the special issue editors for organising this event. I'm really excited, and I've been really excited to read everyone else's contributions. And also hello to a lot of names I can see in the chat. It's great that some of you are here. I won't single out names because I'll use up my 5 minutes, but yeah, my impetus for writing this piece is that I am a probably career-long Morris watcher. And I've turned what began as a fandom into a fine art and into, dare I say, a big part of my academic career. So I'm a kind of an insider on this in a way, but with a 30-year plus history of not coming at Morris, particularly from the Hugh Grant angle, as I think is probably quite apparent in my analysis. And when I saw the call for this special issue, I felt I couldn't not put in a proposal, because I've had the luxury of observing, Hugh Grant and the various publicity discourses and star projections and star discourses, and the initial introduction of what the media at the time called these three young men all with shining futures. So I've been watching this transtemporally. My study of the fandom around Morris more recently is transtemporal as well. I mean, we could even say that the Tumblr fandom has its own historicity already. What you see on Tumblr today is not what you'd have seen in 2010, 2011 when I started this work. And I was interested in approaching Hugh Grant from this angle, firstly, because to me, Hugh Grant is still an actor I associate with the early 80s and some of his choices that have been largely buried and forgotten before he became the big rom-com star. Secondly, of interest, because I have in some case, I guess, unique access to primary materials, because I've been to James Ivory's production archives in Oregon, as well as having my own collections of material around the film. And I felt that there was just so much rich material here, but which probably wouldn't get written about if I didn't do it. It was going to have to be me to do it. I wasn't sure that anybody else would have these primary materials to do what I've tried to do, albeit rather imperfectly, in my contribution. And the early discourse around Hugh Grant is interesting, firstly, because he's not a star at that point. The media don't know who he is already. And secondly, because actually some of the reactions to him are not sympathetic. Thirdly, because at that period in British celebrity and actor journalism, I don't know if anyone's going to dispute with me on this, but certainly my impression is that at that period, my memory at that period is that the way young actors were approached by the media was fairly unfiltered. It wasn't heavily guarded by PRs. There didn't seem to be particularly heavy publicist control about what they did or didn't say. It wasn't tightly controlled, in great contrast with the way that a star of Hugh Grant's magnitude and power and success will invariably be treated today. So I thought there was material to be analysed and unearthed that is going to, shed different light from what we get in more recent discussions of Hugh Grant. And I'm also particularly interested in that period of his career. And I'm interested in the fact, I was partly interested to problematise and question the notion that he has turned from lighter and comic roles to serious roles, because I think if you go back to Morris, that's clearly the good actor and the serious actor and the player of complex roles is already there. And we can see that in a lot of the, very, very complex reactions to Clive as a character in Morris, and also how those have changed over the years. There are many, many different constituencies, many, many different sorts of responses to Clive. And again, I think what you see on Tumblr today isn't what you would have seen 10 years ago, and it's not what you might see on some gay male platforms 10 years ago, for example, either. And there are some extremes to that reaction that I have even slightly redacted in my piece. So that's more than 5 minutes, isn't it?
That's completely fine. No worries. If you want to add something else, please feel free to do that.
Yeah, I think anything else really will come out in the wider discussion. We're apparent to people that I'm approaching this as a scholar of British cinema with a lot of interest in masculinities, particularly in British film in the period since the 80s, to some extent back to the 1970s. Less from a strictly celebrity studies or celebrity theory angle. So I'm very happy to have other people's inputs into what my piece doesn't do as well.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you so much. So next up, we have Renée Middlemost.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Please forgive me if I'm not as lucid as I could be. It's 5:22 a.m. here. I'm calling from Wollongong, Australia. So yeah, on the East Coast, it's pretty early. So thanks again for having me. Just talk a little bit about the paper that I've written for this article, for this issue. See, can't speak too early. This really was like a joy that kept me going during the pandemic. So I really do want to extend my thanks to everyone involved. It was just one of those little projects that I could keep coming back to amongst the grind of teaching at home and all of the rest of it. So essentially what I tried to do in this paper is I was looking at the press coverage of Hugh Grant's 3 scandals, if you like, over his 30-year career. So what I was trying to do here is to take celebrity studies approaches and apply that to press coverage. So basically, I was trying to look at how celebrity confessionals have been central to Grant's enduring popularity and his evolving star persona. So even though his career has been interrupted by several hiatuses, there's been this kind of perception that there's a discursive harmony, if you like, between Grant's initial screen persona and stage image, but that's been ruptured over time by these 3 key scandals and confessions that have subsequently kind of interrupted, I suppose, what we like to think about Hugh Grant. So the three scandals I used were the arrest for soliciting a sex worker in the 90s, which is probably the most well-known kind of scandal. And then we've got the News of the World phone hacking scandal that he got embroiled in, and then the road to fatherhood and the subsequent kind of hammering he took in the right-wing press for fathering children with several different women, which really is, you know, just one of those things. But yeah, apparently this is unacceptable to the Murdoch media. So really the key feature, I suppose, of what I was trying to do here was to think or rethink this idea of the celebrity confessional. So obviously this has been an enduring piece of theory that's sort of driven throughout celebrity studies literature. So what I wanted to do here is to think about the way that Hugh Grant's reworked the confessional to serve his own aims. So I've called it in the article a reverse confessional, if you like. So what I'm claiming here is that what Hugh Grant does in his subsequent confessions, if you like, is that he doesn't actually engage in confession. What he's doing is really an admission. And it's both a form of strategic image management and also becomes over time a method to reinforce his hatred towards the British tabloids. So in each of the incidents, we can see this evolution of Grant's star persona from the star as performer to the star as celebrity, if we think back to Geraghty's work, and then through to more recent iterations where we can think of Hugh Grant as a reluctant celebrity. So I suppose in thinking about the confession, what I wanted to do is to really dig into this and sort of think about how the confession is, you know, rooted in origins of religion and really infers this presence of shame. So the media attempts to publicly shame celebrities when they confess in various ways. And you can particularly see this in the kind of talk show confessions, particularly kind of in the 90s and the early 2000s. So what I wanted to do here is to propose the way that Grant engages with the media is quite unique, and it can be framed as a type of a reverse confessional, which really informs his persona as a reluctant celebrity. So what I wanted to do is think about the way that, because he's actually admitting to these acts that are scandalous, he's actually reversing this confessional mode and placing his own agency at the forefront. So he's not so much being caught out, but he's blunting the scandal and nullifying really the attempts to shame him by admitting to the act in question. And just to kind of close, what I find really interesting about the whole scandal and Hugh Grant and his confessions is that he's still really widely praised for the way that he reacted and responded to the you know, being caught in the act, so to speak, in the 1990s. He's widely praised as kind of this model for celebrity image management, for the way that he really just said, yep, I did that. So yeah, you know, kind of have at me sort of thing. So yeah, I'm happy to talk further in a little while. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Renee. And thank you very much for getting up so very early this morning to be here with us tonight. Yeah.
It's worth it for Hugh Grant.
Sacrifices that we make for our favorites. So yeah, Claire was writing in the chat that she was working at a BFI when the scandal broke out. So definitely we want to hear more gossip about it later. We're definitely interested in that. I
think there's a limit to how much gossip we can have, because we will actually be sued by Hugh if I were to tell you exactly something that was claimed at that date. It's certainly something there that isn't on the record, but it was a boiling hot day. And one of the PhD students, in those days there were PhD students and people like myself who'd just done an MA work there, based within the BFI. And one of the PhD students went out to buy everybody ice creams, went to the newsagent on Rathbone Place and came back, and there were the billboard headlines. And everybody on the floor of the BFI I was on just spent the whole afternoon on the phone phoning everybody they knew, one way or the other. But there was somebody in the building who had a friend in the LAPD, and that's where it gets into the zone where we can't talk about what I was told.
Well,
something that might not be true, and if it is true, we will get into trouble. I think.
Yeah, we don't want any libel kind of.
We can't afford to take.
No, definitely not.
We can't afford to be taken on by Hugh in court. That's what I think.
Definitely not. And speaking about court, this is quite apt because we go to Lydia, who has written about the Leveson inquiry. So Lydia, tell us a bit more about it.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. This has been really interesting hearing what everyone's saying and how mine kind of fits into this. And it's, yeah, I'm rethinking some of the things I've written now, especially about what you were saying about maybe that the early personas were less controlled or media image. So, okay, well, basically mine was on his performance at the Leveson inquiry, and it is a performance in many senses of the word, because it so social performance, and then he lets the mask slip, and then there's the courtroom ritual, and he's also got his hammy comedic skills in there, and then there's set mannerisms. So I've written some notes in case my brain conks out, because I get up several times in the night, and yeah, it's already not working so well. So basically, we've got this very awkward situation in the courtroom. The judge, Justice Leveson, and the counsellor, the cross-examining lawyer, are trying very hard to maintain this somber decorum, the usual courtroom performance. But we've got this awkward tension because there's an audience there. We've got several co-counsel members and clerks and things like that, and there's this sense of excitement that there's a celebrity in the seat. So they're sort of trying to suppress like giggles and smiles and smirks and things. And so Hugh Grant's performance is very strange in this unusual situation. And it's, yeah, fascinating because, so normally I would say that when a celebrity appears in public, especially before a camera, although the camera in the Leveson inquiry is very much secondary, he doesn't play to it. He does just play to the audience in front of him. I would normally categorize that as acting because they're playing their persona, they're paid to, present a personality that is the same as presenting a character. But in this, so the social performance level, at times it's kind of a conversation between the judge, the lawyer, and Hugh Grant. They're working towards a common cause, but then the questioning, it becomes a little bit of an interrogation, or at least Hugh Grant is he's very quick to anger. A lot of the time, he snaps, and so his social mask totally slips, and he would just come up with a comment, and then would just try and calm himself down. But then there's also things like so part of the courtroom ritual, when he's given instructions, he's so sort of fixed on that he's not monitoring himself at all. So he's doing things like sticking his tongue out and like trying to eat his own tie at one point. So this is like all the stuff that you wouldn't, in media training, you kind of learn to control all of this. So he's kind of let the media side go, but what he hasn't let go is the thespian within him. He can't seem to. There is Phoenix Buchanan from Paddington 2 is very much there. Comes out. So he's asked to introduce himself, and he says Hugh Mungo Grant, which gets a laugh from the audience, which is kind of inappropriate for this, but it's so he hasn't lost his acting skills, because so we can't say it's not acting, at times it is acting, because the judge tries to tell a joke. He's like, if you want to have a break, you don't need to call cut or anything like that, and it just totally falls flat because he's not an actor. It's Hugh Grant knows how to make a joke land. He knows how to make an audience laugh. We've also got the politician coming out. He's got these set mannerisms that he does when he finally calmed himself down. He's got his hands up, but okay. This one is the easier one to show, I think, in this. Very much sort of Tony Blair type stuff, which I think is also the Love Actually Prime Minister, which I think was also sort of based on Tony Blair. So we've very much got the grumpy persona coming out from his interviews. Over the course of the 3 or 4 years we've been doing this, I've bumped into him not bumped into him, but seen him walking in the street 3 times, and he does look very grumpy. That persona seems to be his sort of genuine thing. So yeah, and then the confessional aspect of it, I touch on that as well, because I compare it to the Jay Leno interview and the whole host of other interviews he did at that time, at the time of the Divine Brown incident. And yeah, this is an airing of dirty laundry, but it's really not, he's not sorry. There's no remorse here. And yeah, Barry King also talks about a controlled performance of interesting personality being the marker of a celebrity interview rather than a demotic interview, like a regular person. And as I was saying, about eating his own tie and stuff like that, it's not a controlled, and with also the snaps as well, it's not a controlled unveiling of an interesting personality. He's all over the place. I mean, one of the things is the swearing of the oath. He just seems like he's never read a line in his life. He's given a piece of paper, it's essentially a script, but he's got to say something so weird that everyone's, a line that everyone's heard before. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but, and he's says it like he's never done any acting before. So yeah, I think this self-presentation in this instance is sort of an intricate web of familiar traits and provoked displays of emotion, which really complicates the persona versus real self dichotomy. It's all just sort of a mismatch of everything.
Thank you so much, Lydia. I think something that Alice and I were really happy to see emerge while we were reading your articles, it was how, how much all of your articles in a way were speaking to each other. So definitely what Renée was setting up in terms of, the broader context, you went into more detail about a specific moment, and similarly, you did a kind of, I think it's a great intervention in terms of performance analysis, and with Marion as well, you really set a great example of, this close analysis of performance in both your articles. So it's really great to see this kind of resonances between all the contributions. Another perhaps link is, while Renée was talking about this kind of reverse confessional in these 3 different phases, Rebecca did something similar in terms of masculinity. So Rebecca, tell us a bit more about your own article.
Thank you. Lydia, if that is you sleep deprived, I can't imagine how good you are on a full night's That was amazing. Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone. Is it all right that I'm going to take a bit of a run up to it? Because I think when we started, it was like bits about who you are and why you're doing it. And mine is quite a long run up, if that's okay. Not in terms of time, just in terms of my kind of journey. So hello, everyone. Apologies, I come up as Poppy's Feasey. This is my daughter's laptop. I tried 3 different machines. So she now isn't doing homework with the best of excuses because I was getting quite frantic that I wasn't getting in on the work machines. And what. So apologies, Beck Feasey. Lovely to see you all in person. So I've had a very, very long relationship with the journal, Celebrity Studies. I think I have been on the extended editorial board right since the beginning. That you know, and I'm always really embarrassed that although I've always taught and on the periphery of doing sort of research on celebrity studies, I'm never quite in it as much as I kind of really wish that I would be, because it is a genuinely fantastic contribution or forerunner in the field, really. And then, of course, this call for pops up, and I'm thinking, oh, that sort of ticks a lot of boxes. And it ticks a lot of boxes because I had to look up the date, which is I've been sort of typing frantically. Back in 2004, I actually delivered, I believe, you know, a conference paper. There was a conference at the University of Nottingham called Love Maybe, a rom-com study day, conference, symposium, study day. Back in my, early sort of, well, crikey, 2 decades ago, crikey, early. And so at the time, I'm thinking, well, obviously it has to be on Hugh Grant. So that sort of sat there for a while. And then I had and it felt like a privilege to write a new module at Bath University. And once I've obviously ticked the boxes of feminist media, obviously, that's first and foremost, another module, okay. Film stardom and celebrity culture. And at the time, if I'm really honest, it was a bit punchy. It wasn't when most university courses, film media kind of courses were running whole modules on celebrity culture. So there was a few raised eyebrows, you know, I was in that early, you know, when we look at Heat magazine early on, you know, that early kind of run of the topic. But from the outset, it's rigorous, it's robust, it's theory-led, you know, I love the analysis. So it will be no surprise to anyone in the room to know that, you know, there's a whole lecture on Richard Dyer's building of popular images, right? We're having to look at star image, star fit, star vehicles. And there's always that notion of, well, how do we create a star image? Promotion, publicity, criticism, commentaries and films. I'm preaching to converted, I know you know this. But in order to kind of get that across, I couldn't help myself. That I'd always be kind of that rom-com paper would be in mind, Hugh Grant. Let me talk about Hugh Grant. Let me talk to you about what it means to have a kind of constructed persona. So we could talk about promotion, publicity. So we separated it all out. And it's a case study I relied on for ages. And every year I could add a little bit more. And every year, I know we talked about sort of fan comments or promotional materials, or, you know, whether there was another review or another film or a sequel, or every year there was a little bit I could add on the end. But it was always a really good way for me to introduce Richard Dyer's kind of work. And so again, the call for papers pops up and I'm thinking, well, never really kind of done more with this. So it gave me a really lovely opportunity. So thank you for that, to actually force some time to actually think about this beyond the confines of you know, a very, very early conference paper and a kind of, you know, a level 5 lecture. So with that in mind, because of the gender studies research I, you know, live in, immerse myself in, I'm thinking, well, for me, it would have to be masculinity. There's so many things obviously can be done and have been done, but it just had to be a question around masculinity. So how do I sort of get beyond that notion of Hugh Grant played Bumbling Fop? We thought he was Bumbling Fop. Hugh Grant, oh, look, very kind of unusual. He's managed to do an actual career transformation. Bounder and Cad, on screen, we seem to find out a bit more Bounder and Cad off screen. So just a nice kind of way of thinking about, okay, going back to Richard Dyer, he always sort of said that you needed all parts of the sort of, you know, the persona to match. Well, Hugh Grant didn't say that he was a good guy. He always said he was a Bounder and Cad, so notions of star image didn't fit, and then they did. But then there's this new, you talked about the phases, then we're kind of this post-feminist father. And I think that's the one that sort of became quite interesting, the notion of the post-feminist father, a bit like people in the room of saying, actually, he didn't sort of, it's sort of why I'm shying away from the publicity, more so sort of, you know, acknowledging it's there, playing a sort of nice kind of give a bit, take a bit. But that notion of post-feminist father gave me sort of a framework to kind of go back and sort of see the phases. And the phases are just really clear. We go from, you know, soft new man to kind of play through the new lad, and then we come out the other side on the kind of, you know, hint at the metrosexual, but really what we're doing is a post-feminist father. And the reason that post-feminist father is really interesting is because it's quite forgiving. So in the room, you know, Renée, you're talking about the different scandals, which is, you know, sorry, kind of Lydia picked up as well. That notion, it kind of don't matter. If you can show that you are a proactive, doesn't matter how many children you got, and it doesn't matter how quickly they came, and it doesn't matter who they were to. None of this, you know, when those really horrible comments that females that were pregnant, you know, that I'm only just going to say 4x4, you know, those sorts of phrases, none of that. So none of that. If you've seen with a beautiful small biological child, and those things are important, yeah, on your shoulders, holding a hand, the bar is set so low for celebrity fatherhood, which is a different paper for a different journal, the bar is set so low for celebrity fatherhood that it's just like you sort of, it's the most Herculean thing you could ever do, the most heroic, ironically, both the most masculine thing you can ever do, whilst absolutely reconfiguring what we mean by, you know, kind of contemporary adult masculinity and maturity. So this idea of the post-feminist father, it's like every slate is wiped entirely clean, and it gets to start again, which is why actually I think there's this quite unusual third shift where we can move from the good guy to the naughty boy to the kind of, I'm going to play with character acting now, and all the fun that, you know, we talk about Paddington and what have you, the real fun that seems to kind of come with that, and fun for audiences as well. And I think that notion of this sort of wipe slate clean, that the bar has been set differently, it's just really given him sort of a, when I say career revival, I mean, it's never really gone away, I don't think, in my mind, you know, but in terms of maybe a new audience. So that notion of, I actually wrote it down as you were talking about sort of divine, I wrote an act of lewd conduct. So whether we're talking about an act of lewd conduct or contemporary paternity, this notion of post-feminist fatherhood, which I confess I haven't come up with myself, obviously, that's one I borrowed from people like Shelley Cobb. But it's kind of really interesting to see that, picking up on what Lydia was talking about, the distinct phases. But I do think he is, if not wholly, he's certainly unusual. I'm sort of stopping short of saying unique, but certainly very unusual in the sense that to have a career based on a really rigid star image that was allowed to change not just once, but twice, I'm struggling to think of contemporary performers that can do that. And we can have conversations around masculinity and the body and power. I've even written down, you know, hegemonic hierarchy, because there's still this part of me that's toying with the idea of, has he done that to challenge the hegemonic hierarchy, with, you know, implicitly or otherwise, or actually is it the most clever use of the hegemonic hierarchy? Because guess who's still the white privileged male in power? That's Hugh Grant, right? So, you know, they're deconstructing the hierarchy to stay at the peak of the hierarchy. So mine's a slight kind of mismatch of ideas of kind of gender power, stardom, celebrity culture, fandom, kind of review media, but somewhere in that, I just think there's something very unusual about Hugh Grant. And maybe that's where I leave it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beck. That was really great as well. You mentioned the fun, and I think this is also something that is central to Marion's article. Marion, I think you also have a clip for us. Do you want to share it?
Yes, but in a minute, Eleonora, if that's
yeah,
okay.
Sure.
I just wanted to say a massive thank you to you, Eleonora, and to Alice, because honestly, writing this article has been quite complicated for me during COVID. I was ill, yada. So really, thank you so much, girls, because I couldn't have done it without you. So I had to say that. That being said, I think that my article is maybe the most classical in a sense. I'm very into performance analysis, textual analysis, and so on. What I did is I wanted to show that the performances and star persona of Hugh Grant that is currently developing are both introducing new elements to audiences and yet coming back full circle to his roots in terms of the class-coded white English masculinity embodies. So the corpus I've analysed for this article was Grant's most recent films and television series at the time of writing. So it was Florence Foster Jenkins, Paddington 2, Those two works allow me to analyze Grant's newly joyful image as I see it. Then I moved into a much darker version of this image in a very English scandal and The Undoing on television. So what I wanted to show you guys was that what I see is that in Florence Foster Jenkins is tilting towards a new layer in his persona, which is to me the theatrics and the performance within performance. And what I see is a very an enjoyment that is very visible. And in my view, it is tied to an act performed by the character, which is itself performed by Hugh Grant. He seems to infuse his performances with a new kind of physicality that shows joy to me. And the elements of theatrics that I see in Florence Foster Jenkins are pushed to bigger comedic effects in his role in Paddington 2. And I wanted to show you the credit scene at the end of the film, which I think is very funny. So this is it. Okay.
It's the rain on the roof, go petty, petty, sit kitty cat, we won't get one for relax and listen to the rain on the roof, go blunk like a blink, blunk like a blink. Let's have a drink and shelter from the showers. Rain, rain, don't go away, fill up the sky. Rain through the night, we'll stay cozy and dry. Listen to the rain on the roof, go, it's petty pat, like a blink, black, pity that it's not a hurricane. Listen to the lovely rain.
Thank you. Well, it seems I didn't need the West End after all. Just a captive audience. What am I like? Guards, lock me up. But wait, you have.
Okay. I'm gonna step sorry. Okay. So I won't rob Eleonora of maybe doing that analysis later. But what I see in this is that the dance sequence serves several purposes. So it is part of the diegetic space of the story. It happens and operates separately from the narrative continuity. So the credits are rolling before the sequence, I believe, and I consider it a reward to the spectator, a last hurrah for Grant's character, and a way for the star to showcase himself and his spectacular abilities. So as spectators, we see the characters acting in line with what he has proven to be in the film, which is a stage performer. But we mostly see the star playing with great panache and not much seriousness with his own image. And a similar way to his character in Sinclair, Phoenix Buchanan here in Paddington 2, he himself seems to perform a character, or at least knowingly embodying the flamboyant actor stereotype, as if he was constantly on display and proving his acting skills, even in the most mundane situation. And then maybe if I have a couple more minutes, Eleonora, sorry, and Alice. In his late 50s, Grant shot A Very English Scandal, and it exhibits the same kind of charm that audiences have come to know him for decades now, except that his character there, Jeremy Thorpe, it conveys what happens to an individual when charm curdles into something considerably darker. And I see that as a prime example of deliberate expressive incoherence, as James Namur put it in his study of film acting. Grant's perform a man who puts on a mask. He splits his character in different aspects. So again, we are in the performance within the performance, and I see the same thing with The Undoing, and I further explore issues of male privileges there, as well as age, power, and status. In The Undoing, is using his charm in a very manipulative way as well, because we're not used to seeing his charm being presented in this inverted mode, and so the performance is quite unsettling. So what I see, generally speaking, is that Grant's acting style and persona are more in a state of perpetual flux, attached to his past work and signature style, and yet increasingly layered with enjoyment for the craft as he ages. And I analyze a bit of what he says in interviews, talk shows, and etc. about the way he sees his career. So it is expressed for me through a new kind of physicality in his acting, or character development through villainy as well. He said that, for instance, the act of killing the lady character in The Undoing was a tremendous joy for him as an actor. So fundamentally, Grant's aging persona is maybe re-established, maybe just re-established on screen, but it does not necessarily construct a different image of white privileged English masculinity that the one he was associated with for years, actually. I just see new stuff, basically. Not very original, but here we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. And the last article is by Leonard Soberon. Alice, would you like to summarize it, as I've been speaking a lot, or would you like me to do that?
I would let you. I think one of the things that, Marion, you maybe have been too modest in, but I think, Eleonora, if I jump in, then you can carry on, is what you've highlighted, and also what connects really nicely to Leonard's piece is how maybe perhaps his later roles are also underlining the kind of levels of intricacies of privilege upon which his stardom is relying on. You know, to do with gender and class, of course, but Leonard's piece is particularly important for us in the way that it also discusses race. Leonard also is one of the contributors that looked at Grant's possibly his latest performances in Death Comes to 2020 and 2021, which were the Charlie Brooker kind of satirical news pieces on Netflix, where he performs as this kind of aging Oxford history professor, you know, and kind of really quite racist in terms of reflecting on Black Lives Matter and, you know, kind of statues being taken down, and again, kind of parodying himself, but perhaps demonstrating to some extent, or engaging in some self-awareness in terms of his racial privilege in a way that he hasn't done perhaps earlier in his career. Eleonora, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, just to say that it's also a nice link, because Leonard is exploring villain stardom in detail in his article. So it links again to Marion's article, and is showing that unlike previous British stars that have been analyzed, and this is one of those articles that is quoting Andrew Spicer. I'm not sure if Andrew is still in the audience, but while in the past, British actors in American films, like Alan Rickman, for example, in Robin Hood, is this sort of like suave, very charming kind of villain, is actually exposing, as Alice was saying, the privilege. So it really puts into relief this kind of privilege that is at the basis of his characters in the past as well. And it is being used by filmmakers to subvert audience expectations, and by Grant himself in his performance, like in Death to 2020 and 2021, to highlight perhaps his own on-screen persona more in general. So this is the article that brings the issue to a close. So we have about half an hour still, and I think it would be great to open the floor to sort of informal conversation. So if any of the contributors have questions to each other, or if indeed anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, please feel free to come on mic or write down in the chat and we'll pick them up. So yes, are there any questions, comments to start with?
I have two provocations I can add if no one else has a question, but I think we should let the audience have their say first, really, if they have any questions. Two provocations. We're all talking about Hugh Grant as English, but he's Scottish. That's why one of his names is Mungo. He's from a Scottish aristocratic background and descended from Sir Walter Raleigh. So we talk of him as the middle-class white Englishman. He's historically, we could say, an extremely upper-class Scotsman. Does this matter in terms of archetypes and how we understand his privilege? And I'm aware that, you know, speaking as a British person who's also of a certain age, I probably have different and I guess more complicated perspectives on all these questions of Englishness versus Britishness and class, which might differ for, you know, global academics and global audiences and people who've come to Hugh Grant as, you know, the reason you crossed the pond to come to the UK kind of, you know, figure. My other thought is that how unusual is Hugh Grant in his level of, I mean, obviously many celebrities are wealthy, but we talk of his career and his career revival and his career, you know, changes as if Hugh Grant has to have an acting career. But he's someone who begins his career by being in massive, albeit rather self-contradictory disavowal about not even wanting an agent, but agents insist on signing him up and they insist on making him a star, you know, as I talk about with some of the quotes when he's interviewed around Morris in my piece. But he's so wealthy, he doesn't need to work. He's so wealthy, he doesn't need to do any of this. So does this affect how we think about his career choices? I mean, in effect, one of his privileges is that he can not just choose the roles he takes, but choose whether to be a star or whether to actually bother acting at all. Hence the career hiatuses. You know, I think I wouldn't interpret his hiatuses as a failure necessarily, and more as periods in his life where maybe he just didn't want to do that. I don't know what we all think about these questions.
I mean, if I can jump in on the Scotsman Englishman question, it's fascinating because when we were writing up the introduction, and I was, you know, doing research, it is the, along with the kind of bumbling or awkward, it is the adjective that is always associated with his name. Every single piece ever written about him is the, and also that, you know, that kind of repetition, the Englishman, that crystallization of it, that kind of essentialization of this idea that there is such a thing as a kind of national essence, you know, right, is fascinating. And again, you know, we know of Richard Morby's work about how that gets translated, but that something is then lost in translation, and that those nuances, you know, and going back to Eleonora and I, growing up in continental Europe, that is absolutely, that distinction is absolutely erased from the discourse. It's really interesting.
But also, Alice, what did you think about my point that he wasn't always bumbling? The bumbling Englishman, Hugh Grant, doesn't really kick in until about 1994 or so. So he's a construction at that period.
Absolutely.
He's not bumbling or inarticulate in Morris or some of the other earlier films as well.
And it's true that kicks in really with the rom-com era, and then if you track it through the ages, it sticks. It's the one thing that sticks. It's what gets said in 1994, again in the 2000s, and still in the kind of the coverage of the pieces that Marion is talking about. It's the one thing that sticks. But you're right that it's not the case when we're in the discourse around Maurice.
But also I mean, from a British, I'm sure Andrew Spicer will have thoughts on this one as well, but from a British film scholar or British cinema perspective, the forms of Englishness that are constructed in those rom-coms are so specific that they've been critiqued as Richard Curtis land and not England. They've been quite widely denounced in various ways. And of course, the Richard Curtis rom-coms are made by the company Working Title, who belong to Universal Studios, and are fairly unique in British film production in that regard. And they also are the producers of Mr. Bean. So, I don't know if we'd be quite so tolerant of the stereotype. If we were talking about Mr. Bean, we'd be probably, be more inclined to question whether that's real. Although you can go to all sorts of places in the world where people really do believe that England is full of Mr. Bean. I've been to North Africa and had elderly Tunisian people who were on a dance holiday in Algeria come up to me and say, and the first thing they say is Mr. Bean. And then they said, give our regards to your Queen Elizabeth, because they thought that if you were English, we all personally knew the Queen, or appeared to think that anyway. So, there's a sort of, I guess as an actual British person, actual English person as well, I'm slightly concerned that we accept so readily that is what the Englishman is. And in some ways, it's a dated idea of what the Englishman is, because it's the Englishman in transition between the mid-20th century stiff upper lip and trying to be in touch with his emotions. Whereas what I was interested to show in some of the media coverage I was quoting and discussing is that by the 80s, Englishmen already were in touch with their emotions and, crying dirtily on screen and punching each other on screen. And, and actually, there were different ideas of what the perfect Englishman and his perfect English manners are like that were floating around in some of the interview material I quote with some of the other actors in Morris. This idea that James Wilby is the perfect Englishman because he can make a perfect cup of coffee and saves the interviewer the embarrassment of having to ask him awkward questions by answering them first, which is, it's a different notion, isn't it? And I don't quite believe that Hugh Grant is bumbling. I believe he was given that role to play and to personify. But of course, a whole generation of actors were auditioned or seen for the same role as Charles in Four Weddings and a Funeral. So there's something in him that, becomes that role, becomes that persona, presumably more or better than the other actors who were seen. But I don't know what the other constructions would have looked like. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit here.
Thank you. Sarah, you have your hand up. And then Beck as well.
I'm still muted. Hi. I just I wanted to kind of come in, I think, a little bit on that point. So I'm just going to put my camera on a little bit. The idea of how much do we kind of how much should he be the Englishman in many ways, but also the idea that a lot of you were talking about how much and how visibly the idea of kind of constructedness and of performance, either pleasurable or kind of manipulated is a word that was used a lot, is now a signal of Hugh Grant. That is also such an intrinsic and visible part of his persona, his presence, everything else. So I wondered if to some degree that increased visibility of constructedness and performance now plays against the idea of him as the Englishman, because there is no truth to him in many ways. It's that sense of he has always been constructing himself. It's one of the things I think is really interesting about Grant is how much the idea of power and control is now so present around him. And I think there's a narrative of he's retold his story, he's regained power. But as you've been talking about, it's the power of kind of white male privilege as well. So I wondered if that kind of countered it, the idea of constructedness and of the pleasure of performance as well.
Beck, yes.
Yeah, sort of. I'm going to slightly bounce from what I was going to say to kind of picking up on that really interesting question about construction. I think in a weird way, we're just sort of reminding ourselves that he's actually an actor. To have to construct, to have to read a bumbling script, right? I think we spent so long assuming he did it so seamlessly. He slipped so easily into. I ran out of adjectives. In all seriousness, right? So. Stammering, I can't even do it. Stuttering, stammering, stumbling, blundering, bumbling. I mean, I'm writing my piece going, how else can I describe this? So, because it's used to, they're used so often for him. So I just think actually it's, and I think it was it you, Renée, who talked about that Christine Geraghty, star celebrity professional performer. And I think actually it's allowed him to make those shifts, because when you watch him as Charles Thacker, you're just thinking, oh, look at Hugh Grant. We fall in love with Hugh Grant because he's slightly non-threatening and possibly a bit weak and a little bit inadequate and sexually inept. And I say fall in love with Hugh Grant because they so cleverly present that as Hugh Grant. And then, of course, Hugh Grant says himself, I played the same role 17 times in a row. Yeah. And he's kind of shameless about it. And so that notion of agent, not agent, you can imagine those conversations. How do I get another well-paid Hollywood gig? Whether I need the money or not, it shows power, right? It shows dominance. I might not need the bank account, but it shows I'm right at the hegemonic hierarchy or the A-list, and probably how they're working together. So I actually think that notion of, oh, let's look back, isn't he clever? The script fumblings were literally scripted, right? They're not actually Hugh Grant. I don't believe Oxbridge educated Hugh Grant has ever actually fumbled a line in his life, Leveson or otherwise, right? It just, he's unbelievably erudite and kind of articulate and eloquent. But he did it so effortlessly. And that's where I sort of started at the beginning. We don't really talk about Hugh Grant as an actor, partly because it's rom-com mostly. And that's not really where we put those conversations of, performance versus kind of, what was it, impersonation versus personification, to Barry King, and all those sorts of debates. So I think actually, weirdly, on the one hand, you might be saying, oh, it's making us kind of slightly reconsider the construction. But how brilliant, we reconsidering the construction going, oh my God, you were acting. You're really good. Because I tell you what, I bought into it and I thought that's who you were. I don't think there's any higher praise for an actor. You were so convincing, I assumed that was who you were. So weirdly, it gives with one hand, it takes with the other, because we might question the authenticity, but I tell you what, we're finally confirming that the man can actually act. And have to say, the Paddington sketch, I do this in a seminar occasionally, show a small clip, and occasionally you go, can we just leave it on a bit? It's cheered me right up, and I now know what I want to do when I get off this call. I want to go watch Paddington 2 again. Thank you.
Thank you. Marion, yes.
Yes, to respond quickly to that is that it goes on as well with what Alice and Eleonora said in the introduction, which it has to do with the genre, the rom-com itself, as it is a bit not a bit, but downgraded compared to other genre. And then we don't think of actors in rom-com, well, general public maybe, as great actors, when it is obvious to us that he was. And so that was fascinating to me to see that kind of renaissance, which I think it's not really a renaissance at all. It's just a different turn in terms of roles, and a different kind of performance, which is more into what I see theatrics and exaggerated grins, like we saw in that clip of Paddington 2, and we see that as well in Florence Foster Jenkins is on stage reciting Shakespeare as the introduction of his character Sinclair, and he's playing with that again in The Undoing. He's playing with the charm. He's not fumbling, not bubbling in any way. He is still turning on the the charm in a different way, and apparently is adding libs such as make an Englishman happy. So there is a purpose there that like you said in the interview, I would only now play British characters. I will never play American characters. I won't do accent, for instance, whether it's true or not, but is purposefully defining himself as that kind of person anyway, that kind of actor. And I do a brief analysis of how he is condescending towards his roles in rom-coms. He said, that was not me, that was not what I wanted to do. And now it's much more interesting what I'm doing now, which I find fascinating because like we said, those rom-com roles gave him much money. So made him super rich. So yeah, but so going back to square one with the rom-com not being a very high genre in a way. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. We have a question from Mark.
Hi. I thought it was really interesting a point made previously about like the bumbling Englishman, and Hugh Grant being very erudite and Oxbridge educated, all that sort of stuff, and it kind of got me thinking about someone else who kind of has kind of played the same role, which is Boris Johnson. He's a bumbling Englishman. He's Oxbridge educated. He has floppy hair, and it's that level of kind of power that is involved where anybody else, whether it be a woman or a person of color or a working class person, could never get away with acting like that. That this power kind of allows him to be a certain way, and it's accepted because, oh, it doesn't matter that he sounds stupid, because we just accept that this person is, oh, he's well educated, he's rich. It's fine. It's this performance that we know that Johnson does, and we've seen from Hugh Grant, we know he does. We know that he will get hair and makeup done before an interview and then quickly ruffle his hair before he goes out, because it's the performance. And I wonder if there's perhaps some kind of cinematic education that Boris Johnson went on in the mid to late 90s, where he was like, this could work.
Thank you, Mark. This is really a very good point, and I think it really touches upon what we were, looking when we started to think about this issue, because I think it's not really a case that we have this kind of opposition between Hugh Grant and Boris Johnson via Twitter on Brexit. And other, current issues, national issues in the past few years. It's a sort of dark mirror in a sense of, of each other. So I think it's really, really interesting, and it's a very apt comment to this kind of mirroring that they're doing with each other. I don't know if anybody else wants to add something to this. Renée, yes.
I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting in terms of the whole Twitter stoush that Hugh Grant engaged in around the time of the last election, and kind of subsequently in this persona he does as, the defender of justice, or whatever you want to call it, since Leveson. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point as well, to kind of think about the dark mirror aspect of all of that.
Yeah,
I love online Hugh, to be honest. I think that's his best performance. But yeah.
Claire, you were talking about distinctions. You're on mute right now.
Okay, yeah, I was laughing at Mark's comment, because I was in the same year at the same Oxford College as Boris Johnson, and I was a Gothic punk from a working class background whose mother lived on £3,000 a year. And I can tell you, I went through 3 years at that college and was only spoken to once by Boris Johnson. And I can tell you that the only time he spoke to me proves that he is not intelligent. He does not know how to work washing machines and dryers. And that's the only time he spoke to me, quite seriously. I would draw a distinction because I think Hugh Grant actually is intelligent compared to Boris Johnson. And there are also different strata of privilege in terms of their education. Hugh Grant's school background before Oxford shows competitive entry into a, primarily intellectual day school in London, which is not as expensive as somewhere like Eton, but is more likely to yield actually intelligent students on balance. I think there are some distinctions there, but it's easy to see how, the minute we start looking at Oxford privilege and, I hear that Mark is from the north from his voice, we would think that, we don't see that there's these different layers and grey areas, I think, going on within that, really. Can confirm exactly. And people like me don't go to Oxbridge. I mean, the older I get, the more I revert to someone where nobody believes I went there at all. Which tells you something about going to Oxford or Cambridge from the wrong class background. And I think I would say the world has become more sharply and clearly elitist and exclusionary since the 80s, actually, or since the 70s in Grant's case. I think the world has got worse in a lot of ways. But yeah, he can get away with, Grant can get away with this. And I think there's an assurance behind him appearing bumbling. He can get away with it in a way that a woman wouldn't. I think that is true.
Yeah. Alice.
And I wondered, and it's more a question for Rebecca and Renee almost around the question of fatherhood. And it's a bit between Boris Johnson, and fathering multiple children in one case, however many we don't know, and how significantly different that is, and how they've reacted completely differently. Hugh Grant in the conventional and, being very open about it. Boris Johnson absolutely consistently to this day refusing to say how many children he has and how we might compare the two. I don't know if either of you, sorry to throw you up.
No, to me, it's about, I guess Hugh Grant needs us to buy cinema tickets, not votes, in terms of the reality of a conservative. Hugh Grant's many things, I don't think we'd ever accuse him at any point of being conservative. And again, I'm being careful because, as we say, don't want anybody's lawyers coming down on us, but my sense is that one of them can be open. And again, that post-feminist fatherhood, it's not doing Hugh Grant any harm. He speaks with, respect and reverence. He talks about them being the most important thing and that nothing ever mattered till this point. He basically speaks like we've always expected mums to speak of the pronatal period. I never knew joy. I never knew love. I've never, can you imagine putting someone before myself? Now I do. He really is, to use a quote we've all talked about, playing a part perfectly. I don't know whether he's playing a part or living the part or experiencing it, but he seems to be playing the particular part of post-feminist fatherhood perfectly. I'm not sure anyone would accuse us of, or accuse Boris of playing it quite so well. And maybe that's why he's less vocal about it. But also, it doesn't message well in terms of the rest of the persona that Boris is trying to present to the party. Hugh Grant doesn't need to do that. Although both have got wealth, privilege, power, and, so yeah, that's in that sense, absolutely. And the hair, of course. I love that there could be whole papers on his hair, only half joking.
No, that would be a great paper. I would totally read it. Yeah. Thank you. Pauline, yes.
Hi, I just want to, can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
we can.
Okay, sometimes I have problems with the mic on, oh, that's on Teams, that's different, I just remembered. Okay, I just wanted to congratulate you on all your contributions to this edition. I think it's fabulous. I've really enjoyed it. I'm reading, I've only got one left to read, who's the gentleman who's not here, so that's quite good actually. But a few things came up in this that I'm fascinated by, particularly that you're talking about this, I suppose, the idea of, yes, I agree with all of you have said that this performance is I suppose, his ability to perform in public in terms of not just acting as a role, but acting in life and being able to take all I think it's very deliberate. And also he's, I would err on the side of somebody who's extremely articulate and able to manage all of these roles. But the privilege is interesting, and I think it came out with Claire's paper as well about the connections in terms of the roles that he plays. And I mean, this genuinely happens to, I suppose, quite a lot of actors in terms of how they have to use their networks to be able to get other roles, etc. But in many ways, and I'm particularly interested in that to do with Maurice and how his connections with other people within that, the director and the scriptwriter, Kit Hesketh, etc., have all linked to that. And I thought it was interesting that all of the films that you've all mentioned, one of the others, of course, that comes to mind for me, he had a small role, but quite significant, in Remains of the Day. He played Mr. Cardinal, I think was the Lord Darlington's godson, which I thought was quite, again, that to me is probably through the links he's had with all the people who worked on those Merchant Ivory films, etc. So, you know, in a way, that's a small role for somebody in, what year was it, 1992 or something like that? You would think
93, I think, in terms of release.
So, you know, I think as well, being in a position, a privileged position of being able to choose roles that you want, unlike many jobbing actors, let's be honest, who, you know, haven't got that opportunity. It's all quite linked in a sense, but I just think the more I hear you all talking about, the more I realise how much there is to say and how much he's contributed, but also how interesting all the different layers of conversations you can have, and I'm just appreciating it. And thanks for sharing it. Actually, there might be a bit of gossip there I might be able to share, sort of. About 2018, I've been working on the scriptwriter Ruth Jabala's archive for the last 5 or 6 years. I've just completed my doctorate on her, actually, and I catalogued her collection at the British Library. And of course, there isn't a lot about the films things there, just so you know that if you're ever tempted to go and look at it, it is a literary archive and there's very little. Claire has seen the film material in the States, I haven't. But we did have an event in 2008 where we did a celebration for her work, but I had to come up with and talk with the family about asking some people who would contribute. And we had a long list of people and I was a bit nervous about who to ask. But of people on the list. In the end, we had actors like I've gone blank now because that happens to me at this time of night. But anyway, in the top at the back of my mind was I wondered if Hugh Grant had any interaction with her script writing in a couple of the occasions. So I had him in my mind to ask, but I got the impression, I mean, this is only from what I could pick up, that Jim Ivory wasn't particularly, he didn't jump at the idea of me asking him. Let me just say that. I don't know why, but he didn't jump at it. And he also didn't, I put the name of Emma Thompson forward and he said very quickly, oh no, she's far too unpredictable when having her. And so we didn't have those, but we did have other actors and other speakers on the event. But he didn't jump up. And I remember thinking after, was there a reason or was there not? So I don't know the reason, but perhaps again, he didn't feel that maybe in an event of an evening where you get a few minutes to speak, somebody like him might take over I don't know, but that's just my only experience.
Congratulations on your Viva outcome, Pauline. And that was just to say that was an amazing event. I mean, I got stuck in the loos with Anita Desai. You know, it was just a phenomenal event in terms of people who were there.
I didn't know you were there. Oh my goodness.
I think it was Anita Desai and Waris Hussain was there. I mean, it was a bit like who wasn't at that event.
Yeah, well, Hugh Grant wasn't there, but I'd still to this day regret that I didn't sort of.
Just to say, Pauline, did you say, was it 2018? Did you say? Yeah. So was that the year after Hugh Grant had appeared on stage with the Morris restoration at BFI Flair, or was it later the same year?
It was the same year because I think part of the encouragement why Jim Ivory agreed to come over to the States for this thing was because he was also interested in the BFIs. I mean, I asked him about it actually.
But did you hear what Hugh Grant did when he was introducing the film?
No.
I'm grateful Jim Ivory wasn't there. That's all I'm going to say. He made the most gross joke. I mean, I know he's got a gross sense of humour, but he made a really gross joke where I was grateful that Ivory wasn't in the room. So I don't know whether Ivory knew about this somehow. I don't quite know. But I don't know. You can't tell with Ivory. He will have strong opinions and you'll never know quite why.
No.
You know, there's always that. And his opinions can shift around quite a lot as well. It is noticeable. I mean, when he was in the UK, both for the Morris Restoration and, you know, the BAFTAs for Call Me By Your Name, he did meet up with a lot of his former stars because he has an Instagram feed and there's pictures of him. He's got, you know, Lucy and George from A Room with a View, i.e. the aging Helena and Julian Sands together. And what he tags Morris and Alec, of course, he's got Rupert and, you know, James Wilby. But Hugh Grant doesn't seem to be amongst those people. It might just be that Hugh Grant is too rich and important to want to do so. I don't quite know.
I don't know that either. So I just thought it was interesting because, you know, as I say, I felt there was an orbit there, but I never got to that point with him.
Yeah, I think you can never quite get to the bottom of some of these things. Sometimes it can be quite subtle.
There was one thing though, it was quite interesting. You might be interested in as well. In the I think it was the interview. Some of you've mentioned it. I think there was an interview, and it might have been about Maurice after, but there was an interview with James Wilby and Hugh Grant about their acting in Maurice, I believe. And I remember picking up from it. He made a very quick comment about the fact that Jabvala didn't take the script. He sort of hinted that she wasn't keen to take on.
They were drunk. That was in the green room, and if you look at it, they are pissed as newts. And I was shocked. I was quite shocked by that interview actually, because I thought that they were somehow over-reading Ruth's reluctance, or it's a delicate.
Absolutely did. They were hinting that she wouldn't touch it with the barge pole because it was a homosexual story. That was the hint, but there's no evidence that that's the case at all. In fact, she kind of made the point it was for her it was a sub-Forster story. She didn't think it was.
Ruth Jabal had an extreme snobbish prejudice against Morris as a novel, but that wasn't uncommon at the time that film was made. And if you look at the comments of Kit Harvey, rest in peace, as you probably know, Kit Harvey was found dead last week, and Julian Sands is missing, someone possibly dead on a mountain in California at the moment. So some of these people are dropping like flies, or one hopes they're not all dropping like flies. But Kit Harvey was found, he died peacefully while listening to Radio 3. He was only 65. But if you look at Kit Harvey's comments about co-adapting Morris with James Ivory, there's a big vibe that nobody has a high opinion of the novel. And Ruth was very opinionated about it, but there are features of the adaptation that can be attributed and have been attributed by the academic Suzanne Spiegel, who's the person who's studied the scripts more closely than I have actually, and earlier than I did. And Suzanne Spiegel's opinion is that there are features of the difficulty of the adaptation of Morris and the convolution it goes through in terms of the script stages, which is unlike any other Merchant Ivory film, and the alterations to the story order, which are unlike any other Merchant Ivory film at the time of process. And Spiegel's theory was that this only happens because everybody is under pressure to prove that they're improving a so-called inferior novel. So it's not just Ruth. And I think you're right. They somehow managed to, in that interview with the Green Room interview at the BFI, Grant and Wilby somehow, I think they're very drunk, firstly. And that's very apparent when they're on stage with, or is it whoever it is was on stage with them as well. They clearly were not sober. They hadn't seen each other in decades, and I think that plays in as well. But I think they somehow overstep and overinterpret her reluctance. I think what's happened is that they've read about her reluctance, or they knew of her reluctance, and somehow they give this exaggerated account of it, which, as you say, Pauline, it's all a lot more delicate and enigmatic than that. And they say it must have been very hurtful for Jim. And you think, but Jim remained incredibly close friends with her.
No, he did say he's a memoir that came out last year, sort of a memoir really, which doesn't really help all the film critics among you, etc.
It's not at all a helpful memoir, is it? And
it doesn't talk about his films that much at all. It talks about his own life.
I do smell, but we know what Bruce Chatwin's penis was like, and a number of other penises. It's a very odd book.
I think this is an interesting point. I'm just aware of time, and I know that there are a couple of
Can you
hands
just
up.
let
Sorry.
Pauline was about to
Interrupt.
finish, sorry, and I interrupted her.
Sorry.
Yeah, Pauline had something else to say, I think.
No, please,
Sorry.
I've said enough, I think. But you know, I just thought it'd be interesting for you to hear those bits now.
Sarah and then Marion.
If that's okay, if nobody else who hasn't spoken yet has a question. I just wanted to really kind of go back. It's partly something that Renée had said much earlier, and it links to Lydia's article particularly, but just how important kind of Levinson and Hacked Off as a kind of narrative in Grant's career has been, because it seems to have allowed him to, you know, essentially be a hero. Go back to the Boris Johnson discussion as well, to suddenly, you know, to very coherently be a hero figure, to be on the right side, to be, you know, authentic in a realm where we've discussed performance kind of around this. And I kind of wonder, you know, as iconic as his early career was, would you have the special edition if we didn't have Paddington 2 and if we didn't have Levinson? And I just kind of wanted to kind of go back at how important that particular moment is, really, the social justice moment.
I was just going to say that, yeah, I totally agree with you, Sarah. I think it's essential, an essential turning point in his career, really. And what I really enjoy is just going back to the whole crisis management thing from the Divine Brown incident, is it almost allows him a legitimate forum to channel this hatred of the press that grew up around that time into something that's, you know, not really about him, and allows him this hero role. So yeah, but I'm sure Lydia has a lot more maybe to say about this.
So the main thing that I kept thinking of when everyone was talking about power is how it totally goes against every fiber of his being to play any less status than than the protagonist of anything, whether he's acting or not. Just in this courtroom, he tries very hard. It is a really good effort, a really good acting effort to defer to the judge. Thank you, yes, sorry, I will. But he tries to turn the tables at every turn to. I think it is part of this privilege thing. He cannot play anything less than privileged, and I think the politician as well. So in the documentary, he is the hero politician. He's got sort of self-deprecating remarks like, "I'm not just a trouser dropping celeb." He's and so the difference between the Hugh Grant of the documentary and the politician in the Leveson inquiry is that he's trying to resist the victim role, and it's not something that seems to be a comfortable fit for him. It seems to be very hard for him to play.
Can we have Karen in the chat was also agreeing with what Renée was saying? So it's a sort of like consistent construction of image, manipulative rather than just very smart. So there was an agreement there as well. Perhaps to conclude, Marion, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, no, maybe it was an idea I had listening to you all about maybe next issue on Emma Thompson would be great, because she is so good on her own, of course, but also paired with Hugh Grant, and maybe all the ladies of Hugh Grant, but a special issue on them, would be great. It's just as I thought of Emma Thompson, how she will be a good comparison point to Hugh Grant in terms of aging stars and stuff like that. Would be interesting. Just I love her so much. That was just my final word.
I would be on board with an Emma Thompson issue or even an article. That would be really, really interesting for sure. And Mark was commenting in, no, Matthew, sorry, was commenting in the chat that to Lydia's point, the Graham Norton clip where you mentioned Drew Barrymore tried to give him acting notes, and that was not really the case. That was, I think, definitely a very interesting interview. And as usual on the Graham Norton couch, you know, keeps on giving, because we always have some very interesting interviews on that show. So it's a really good point and quite revealing indeed, as Sarah is saying. Well, I think we're already past 7:30, and I know it's very early for Renée. It's the middle of the day for Erin. So perhaps we can conclude here. And just to say once again, thank you very much to everyone who has contributed to the issue, to Erin and Alice for welcoming us in Celebrity Studies. And thank you everyone for participating. Thank you so much, and congratulations to all of you.
Thank you so much for doing all the hard work. It was
Thank
wonderful. Lovely to see you all.
Yeah,
it was a pleasure.
Yeah, it's lovely. Thank you for organising such a brilliant event, and thank you to everybody for such great questions.
And I'll just add that I received the proofs for the print edition today, coincidentally. So the print edition is on track to come out in March as well. So
that's really good news, because my my institute head almost refused to promote this internally because he claimed it wasn't published yet, even though we're having a roundtable.
Well, it is ready to go for March. It's online, but it's ready to go for March.
Yeah, yeah. I had one more comment for Marion, but I think we're well over time, aren't we? I loved your analysis of the performance within performance, and it made me think actually that that's already there earlier. I think there's elements of that I see even in Morris.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Claire. It means so much to me. You're saying that. Thank you.
No, it was that's so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.